They like to say justice is blind, but in Judge Raymond Holloway's courtroom, justice wasn't blind at all. It saw everything it wanted to see and ignored the rest. In the small town of Redwood Falls, everyone understood the rule, even if it was never written down. If you had money, connections, or the right last name, the law leaned in and listened. If you didn't, the law moved fast, spoke loud, and crushed you without apology. Courtroom B smelled like dust, old paper, and burnt coffee that had been sitting on a hot plate since dawn. The air conditioning rattled uselessly, coughing out warm air that did nothing to ease the heavy summer heat. Ceiling fans spun lazily overhead, more decoration than relief. On the last bench, near the back wall, sat a man no one paid attention to. He was 78 years old. His shoulders were narrow but straight. His hands rested calmly on top of a wooden cane, polished smooth by decades of use. He wore a simple button-down shirt tucked neatly into slacks that had been pressed that morning. His shoes were old but clean, the kind of shoes worn by a man who still believed showing respect mattered, even when respect was rarely returned. His name was Walter Finch. Most people assumed he was confused, maybe there by mistake, maybe dragged in by paperwork he didn't understand. In Redwood Falls, men like Walter were expected to sit quietly, nod politely, and accept whatever came their way. Judge Holloway noticed him too, but not with curiosity, with amusement. When the clerk called Walter's case, a few quiet chuckles rippled through the courtroom. Walter stood slowly. His knees protested, but he ignored them. He didn't rush. He didn't stumble. He walked forward with steady steps, each one deliberate, like a man who had learned patience the hard way. Judge Holloway leaned back in his chair, one arm draped over the side like he was watching a dull TV show. "Well," the judge said loudly, glancing down at the file, "this should be quick." Walter stopped at the defense table and waited. "You're here over a property violation, unmaintained structure, failure to respond to notices. That sound about right to you, Mr. Finch?" Walter cleared his throat once. His voice, when it came, was calm and even. "I believe there's been a misunderstanding, Your Honor." The judge snorted. "Of course there has. There always is." A few people laughed. Walter didn't react. He simply stood there, hands folded, eyes steady. "You got a lawyer?" Holloway asked. "No, sir." The judge smiled wider. "Didn't think so." Holloway tapped his pen against the bench. "Let me guess. You didn't get the letters. You didn't understand the process. You thought it would all just go away." "That's not correct," replied Walter politely. Holloway finally looked up. His eyes swept over Walter's clothes, his cane, his age. His expression hardened, not with anger, but with certainty. "Listen," the judge said, voice sharp now. "This court doesn't have time for games. The city says your property's a mess. I trust the city. You ignored them. That means fines." Walter inhaled slowly. "With respect," he said, "the notices were sent to the property itself, which has been vacant for years. Procedure requires—" The gavel came down hard. "Don't quote procedure to me. I run this courtroom." The room went quiet. Walter stood still. He did not apologize. He did not raise his voice. He simply looked at the judge with an expression that was not anger, but disappointment. That look irritated Holloway more than shouting ever could. "You know what?" the judge said, leaning forward. "I don't like your attitude. $500 in fines, effective immediately." A murmur moved through the courtroom. Walter didn't blink. "With all due respect," he said quietly, "that violates due process." The judge laughed, loud, ugly. "Due process?" Holloway mocked. "You been watching courtroom dramas, old man?" The laughter this time was nervous. Walter said nothing more. Inside his jacket was a small recorder already running. Inside his mind
was a plan that had been forming for months. Judge Holloway thought he was dealing with just another powerless old man. He had no idea this was the moment everything began to fall apart.
Before we go further, let me know where you're watching from, your city and state. Comment below. Hit subscribe to see what happens next. Judge Holloway expected the old man to argue. That's usually how it went. People got loud when they were cornered, they begged, they blamed, they cracked. But Walter Finch did none of that. After the gavel came down, Walter simply nodded once as if the judge had confirmed something he already knew. He turned slowly and walked back to his seat, the wooden cane tapping softly against the tiled floor. No anger, no embarrassment, just calm. That unsettled Holloway more than he cared to admit. Most defendants his age left the courtroom shaken. Some cried, some cursed the system under their breath. Walter sat down, folded his hands, and stared straight ahead as if he were waiting for a bus. The next case was called, then another, but Judge Holloway kept glancing toward the back row. Walter Finch wasn't taking notes, wasn't whispering to anyone. He wasn't even watching the proceedings closely. His eyes rested on the American flag near the wall, its edges frayed, the gold fringe dull with age. That flag had been there since the courthouse opened in the late 1960s. Walter remembered that. He remembered a lot of things. He remembered building homes that other men lived in but never invited him into. He remembered laws changing on paper while staying the same in practice. He remembered being told again and again to be patient. And he had been patient, painfully so. After an hour, the clerk announced a short recess. Judge Holloway stood and left through the side door, his robe swaying as he walked. In the hallway, he accepted a cup of coffee from his assistant. "Who was that old guy?" the assistant asked casually. "The one with the property case?" Holloway scoffed. "Nobody. Just another one who thinks age earns him sympathy." The assistant hesitated. He didn't seem confused. "No," Holloway said, sipping his coffee. He seemed annoying. Back in the courtroom, most people stood, stretching their legs or whispering anxiously. Walter remained seated. A young clerk approached him, holding a clipboard. "Mr. Finch," she said kindly, "if you need help understanding the fine or setting up a payment plan, I understand it perfectly," she replied gently. She smiled awkwardly and walked away. What no one noticed was Walter's hand slipping into his jacket pocket, checking the recorder, still running, every word, every laugh, every dismissal. Walter had learned a long time ago that memory fades, but recordings don't. Across the room, two men in expensive suits whispered to each other, glancing at Walter like he was a piece of outdated furniture. One of them chuckled. "Probably won't even live long enough to pay the fine," he muttered. Walter heard it. He did not react. At exactly 11:47 a.m., Judge Holloway returned to the bench. "Court is back in session," he announced. Before the clerk could call the next case, Walter stood. The room froze. Holloway frowned. "Sit down," he barked. "You've had your turn." Walter didn't sit. "Your Honor," he said calmly, "I have a procedural request." Holloway laughed again, shaking his head. "This isn't a suggestion box, Mr. Finch. It concerns the court's jurisdiction." A ripple of murmurs passed through the benches. The judge's smile faded. "You don't get to question my jurisdiction." "Actually," said Walter softly, "I do." Silence. Holloway leaned forward. "Bailiff." The bailiff shifted, but didn't move. Walter reached into his jacket, not quickly, not threateningly, and pulled out a folded document. He held it up between two fingers. "This court is currently under review," Walter continued, voice steady, "for repeated procedural violations. I am here today in an observational capacity." Holloway's face tightened.
"You expect me to believe that?" he snapped. Walter met his eyes for the first time. "No," said Walter, "I expect you to remember it." The judge slammed his gavel. "You're done here." Walter nodded once. "Yes," he agreed, "you are." The courtroom buzzed with confusion. Judge Holloway thought this was bluff, theater, a desperate old man grasping at dignity. He had no idea that by the end of the day, his name would be whispered very differently in Redwood Falls. And Walter Finch? He finally sat down, because the real hearing hadn't started yet.
Judge Holloway dismissed the rest of the morning docket faster than usual. Cases that normally took 10 minutes were wrapped up in 3. Fines were issued without explanation. Motions were denied without comment. He wanted the courtroom cleared. He wanted the old man gone. But Walter Finch didn't leave. He sat quietly as the benches emptied, watching people shuffle past him with tired eyes and slumped shoulders. Some glanced at him with curiosity now, others with something closer to respect. By noon, only a handful of people remained. The clerk gathered files. The bailiff checked his watch. Holloway removed his glasses and rubbed his temples. "Mr. Finch," he said sharply, "why are you still here?" Walter rose slowly, leaning on his cane. "Because," he said, "you haven't finished." Holloway laughed, but the sound came out thin. "I finish when I say I finish." Walter stepped forward, stopping several feet from the bench. "In 2003, this court ruled in favor of the city in a property seizure case without notifying the owner. In 2009, the same thing happened again. In 2016, you denied a continuance to a defendant who was hospitalized." The courtroom went still. Holloway's eyes narrowed. "What is this?" "A pattern," Walter replied. The clerk froze mid-step. "You're reciting public cases. So what?" "So am I," Walter said calmly, "and so are others." He reached into his jacket and placed a thick folder on the defense table. It landed with a heavy thud that echoed louder than the gavel ever had. Inside were copies of transcripts, filings, and sworn statements. Holloway stared at the folder, but didn't touch it. "You think you can intimidate this court?" he asked. "No, I think you've been doing that just fine on your own." The bailiff shifted his weight. "You're out of line," Holloway snapped. "I'm precisely on it." There was something different now. The murmurs weren't mocking anymore. They were uneasy, attentive. Holloway leaned forward. "Who sent you?" Walter didn't answer. "I asked you a question," the judge barked. Walter held his gaze. "No," he said simply. Holloway's jaw tightened. "Bailiff, escort Mr. Finch out." The bailiff hesitated. Walter spoke again before anyone moved. "In my 78 years, I've learned something about power. The loudest voice in the room rarely belongs to the strongest person." Holloway slammed the gavel. "Enough!" Walter raised one hand, not in surrender, but in patience. "This recorder," he tapped his jacket pocket, "has captured every word spoken to me today, including the laughter, including the dismissal, including the fine issued without review." The clerk swallowed hard. Holloway's face lost color. "You recorded court proceedings?" the judge hissed. "Public courtroom, perfectly legal." Holloway stood up. "You're finished here." Walter nodded. "So I've been told." He turned to leave, then paused. "One more thing," he said, without turning around. "You should cancel your afternoon meetings." Holloway scoffed. "Why would I do that?" "Because," Walter said, finally facing him again, "people will be arriving who expect your full attention." The door at the back of the courtroom opened. 2 men in dark suits stepped inside, followed by a woman carrying a leather briefcase. They didn't look around. They didn't whisper. They walked straight toward the bench. The bailiff stiffened. The clerk stood. Judge Holloway froze. The woman spoke first. "Judge Raymond Holloway?" "Yes," he said cautiously. She opened the briefcase and removed a badge. "We need to speak with you, privately." The courtroom felt suddenly very small.
Walter continued walking, cane tapping softly against the floor. For the first time that day, Judge Holloway didn't laugh. He didn't speak at all, because he was finally beginning to understand that the old man he had dismissed wasn't asking for justice. He was auditing it.
The courtroom doors closed behind Judge Holloway. The sound echoed louder than the gavel ever had. Inside the judge's chambers, the air felt colder, not from the broken air conditioning, but from the quiet that followed authority when it finally ran out of words. The woman with the briefcase sat across from Holloway, setting her badge on the table where he could see it clearly. "This won't take long," she said. "It depends on how honest you decide to be." Holloway straightened his robe, trying to regain ground. "I know my rights." "We're counting on that," she replied. Outside, in the hallway, Walter Finch sat on a wooden bench beneath a framed photograph of the courthouse opening ceremony. He remembered that day. He remembered standing across the street, watching men in suits shake hands while he waited for a bus that never came on time. 78 years gave a man plenty of memories, some warm, some sharp. A young public defender sat beside him, uncertain. "Sir, are you okay?" Walter smiled faintly. "I've been okay for a long time." She didn't know what that meant, but she felt it. Inside the chambers, folders were opened, names were read, dates were confirmed, patterns traced with careful fingers. "You've overturned property rights without notice at least 12 times, the woman said evenly. "All within the same neighborhoods." Holloway scoffed. "Coincidence." "Coincidence has limits," she replied. She slid a transcript across the table. "This one caught our attention." Holloway scanned it. His eyes stopped. "That case," he said quietly, "the defendant didn't show." "He was in the hospital," she said. "You denied the continuance." Holloway said nothing. Back in the hallway, Walter shifted his cane, his hand resting on the worn handle. That cane had belonged to his father, carried through winters and summers, strikes and layoffs. It had supported a man who built roads he wasn't allowed to drive on. Walter never forgot that. The door to the chambers opened. The woman stepped out first. "Mr. Finch," she said respectfully, "thank you for your patience." Walter stood slowly. Judge Holloway followed, his face drained, his steps uncertain. The courtroom had filled again. Word had spread. People returned, curious, sensing something had changed. The woman addressed the room. "This court is adjourned for the day," she announced, "effective immediately." A murmur spread like a breeze through tall grass. Judge Holloway opened his mouth. She raised a hand. "No." That single word held more authority than all his years on the bench. Holloway sat down heavily. Walter stepped forward. "For the record, I'd like my fine dismissed." The woman nodded. "Already done." Holloway looked up at Walter, something like fear flickering in his eyes. "You planned this," he muttered. Walter met his gaze, not with triumph, but with sadness. "No," he said, "you did." The bailiff approached Holloway. "Sir, we need your keys." Holloway hesitated, then removed them slowly, placing them on the bench. Metal clinked against wood. The sound felt final. Walter turned to leave. As he passed the bench, Holloway spoke, voice low. "Why now?" Walter paused. "Because," he said softly, "I've spent most of my life being told to wait my turn." He looked around the room, at the peeling paint, the tired faces, the flag with frayed edges. "I waited long enough." He walked out of the courtroom, sunlight spilling across the floor as the doors opened wide. Outside,
The courthouse steps were warm. Walter took a deep breath. For the first time in years, his shoulders felt lighter. But the story wasn't over yet, because accountability doesn't end with exposure. It ends with consequences.
Walter Finch walked down the courthouse steps, feeling the morning sun warm his face. Each step was careful, measured, his cane tapping a steady rhythm, almost like a heartbeat, marking the years he had endured. The street was quieter than usual. Some neighbors paused to nod, others whispered behind curtains. News traveled fast, but the impact of justice traveled faster. Walter didn't need attention, he just needed closure. He reached the corner where a small diner had been open for decades. Its sign creaked in the breeze. Finch and Sons, family since '54. Walter smiled faintly. His father had loved this place, and now the taste of fresh coffee felt like a tiny victory. Inside, he saw familiar faces, people who had once been silenced by fear, now cautiously daring to smile. A young man waved him over, a former neighbor who had endured Holloway's rulings years ago. "Mr. Finch," the man said, voice trembling slightly. I heard what happened." Walter nodded. "It's done. Now it's up to them to make it right." Outside, police cars and news vans were leaving. The courthouse steps were emptying, the buzz fading. But inside Walter, a quiet satisfaction settled like the calm after a storm. He had waited a lifetime for justice, and at last it had arrived, not through anger or revenge, but through patience and perseverance. Meanwhile, Judge Holloway sat in a small office, stripped of the power he had clung to for decades. The weight of accountability pressed heavily on his shoulders. He realized, too late, that authority without conscience was hollow. Years of arrogance and unchecked decisions had led here, not with a bang, but with a simple click of a key on a wooden bench. Walter's victory was quiet, but it resonated beyond the courthouse walls. Families, once crushed by unfair rulings, could now breathe easier. Neighbors who had felt powerless now dared to speak. The ripple of one man's steadfast resolve had reminded everyone that justice, no matter how delayed, could still arrive. Walking home, Walter paused on a small bridge overlooking the river. The water flowed steadily, indifferent yet reassuring. He remembered the long years, the losses, the waiting, the silent endurance, and he let the river carry them away. For the first time he felt free, not because the world had changed entirely, but because he had changed the course of one part of it. One act, one voice, one life stood against years of neglect, and it had prevailed. As the sun climbed higher, Walter smiled. The future would still hold challenges, but he knew this truth deeply. Patience, courage, and unwavering integrity could overcome even the darkest legacies. And with that, Walter Finch continued down the street, cane in hand, dignity intact, carrying the quiet triumph of a lifetime finally recognized. If you enjoyed Walter's story of courage, patience, and justice finally served, don't forget to hit that like button, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell so you never miss our next incredible story of perseverance and triumph. Also, share your thoughts in the comments. What would you have done if you were in Walter's shoes?